Unless you are a serious military history buff, you probably haven't heard of the Battle of Malplaquet. But if you're alive in the 1700s, you most certainly would have. Not only was it the Duke of Marlborough's fourth, although Pyrrhic, victory over the French, but more importantly, it was also the bloodiest European battle of the whole 18th century. Between 30 and 40,000 men were killed or wounded in one day. 2/3 of them were from Marlborough's army. And despite being forced from the field, the French were able to keep their army intact, ready to fight another day. Their sort of Dunkirk moment. That French escape, along with his heavy losses, was the beginning of the end for John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. Within 2 years, arguably the greatest military commander in British history was sacked. This is the story of that bloody battle, fought on the 11th of September 1709, the Battle of Malplaquet. Before we get to the Battle of Malplaquet, I will quickly put it into context, both the war itself and then events leading up to the battle in September 1709. The War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714, was fought by an alliance of European powers, including Great Britain, to prevent the ambitious French king, Louis XIV, installing his grandson on the throne of Spain. If you want to know a bit more about how the war broke out and exactly who was fighting who, then check out my episode all about the life and career of the Duke of Marlborough himself. Suffice to say that John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, commanded the Allied armies in the Low Countries, that's modern-day Belgium and Netherlands, threatening France's northern border. He'd already notched up resounding victories over the French and their allies at Blenheim in 1704 and Ramillies in 1706, and again I've covered those battles in separate episodes too. We left off our story about the Duke of Marlborough's campaigns against the French with his victory at Oudenarde in July 1708. That victory put the Allies in a commanding position, controlling almost all of the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, with Marlborough and his Habsburg ally, Prince Eugene of Savoy, poised to strike at France itself. That military situation, coupled with one of the coldest winters in European memory resulting in widespread famine in France, brought King Louis XIV to the negotiating table. However, buoyed up by Marlborough's emphatic victory at Oudenarde, the Allies presented demands that Louis decided were unreasonable, and so in 1709 he broke off the talks. He appointed Marshal Claude Louis Hector de Villars to command his armies on the northern border. The king specifically ordered Villars to defend France from invasion. Ordinarily an extremely aggressive general, Villars obeyed, constructing a series of strong fortified defensive lines in the region of the modern Franco-Belgian border. Whilst Villars had a very clear mission from his king, the Duke of Marlborough had a less clear strategy for 1709. As usual, he had to deal with the conflicting agendas of his Dutch and Habsburg Austrian allies. Considering Villars' entrenched positions too strong for a frontal attack, the English general advocated attacking Ypres and then striking into France close to the English Channel. His allies disagreed, and so finally it was decided to capture the city and citadel at Tournai to the east. On the 24th of June, the Allied forces feigned an attack on Ypres, successfully forcing Villars to redeploy, and then turn towards Tournai. By noon on the 27th of June, most of Marlborough's British and Dutch soldiers were in position outside their objective. Prince Eugene's force arrived that evening. Despite being one of the strongest fortresses on the French frontier, Marlborough's attack forced the garrison to surrender on the 3rd of September. Villars was shocked. He had anticipated the garrison holding out until well into October, by which time, thanks to the approach of winter, the campaigning season would be over, and he would have saved France from invasion, well, for another year at least. Now, however, there was still time for Marlborough to strike south, and the Englishman fully intended to do so. He immediately turned his attention to Mons. The capture of this fortress would allow the Allies to enter France itself. Less than 24 hours after Tournai had yielded, the entire Allied army was on the march throughout the night, and 3 days later they were besieging Mons. This turn of events alarmed King Louis as much as it did Marshal Villars, and he now sent his commander explicit orders. Should Mons suffer the same fate as Tournai, our case is undone. You are by every means in your power to relieve the garrison. The cost is not to be considered. The salvation of France is at stake." With direct orders from the king, Villars was eager to confront the Allied army. He now moved his entire force into a covering position about 10 miles, 16 kilometres, south of Mons, near the village of Malplaquet, on the 9th of September. Recalling how in previous battles, Marlborough had effectively shifted troops from his wings, Villars chose his ground carefully. His proposed battlefield was dominated by 2 large woods, the Bois de Sars, or Wood of Sars, on his left, and the Bois de Lanière on the right. This would, he believed, restrict Marlborough's ability to manoeuvre unseen, if at all. And between these 2 woods lay an open space approximately 2 to 2.5 miles wide, with a small copse and a farmhouse in the middle. Effectively, Marlborough would have to attack him down this funnel. Villars placed his army in a concave semicircle, anchoring on both flanking woods, with the open gap in the centre. And that gap was filled with earthworks, entrenchments and redoubts. Along this line he placed the majority of his 80 cannon, although, just for good measure, he also placed some in the woods on both sides, and concealed 20 of them in a small depression on the right to provide excellent enfilade fire. The French right was commanded by Marshal Boufflers. At 67 he was actually Villars' senior, but had volunteered to serve under the younger man. Commanding Boufflers' infantry was Pierre d'Artagnan. And if you're thinking, wow, just like D'Artagnan in the Three Musketeers, well, his cousin, Count d'Artagnan, indeed the model of Alexander Dumas's famous musketeer. With his infantry placed in the woods and redoubts, Villars kept his massed cavalry back for later in the battle. Marlborough had wanted to give battle immediately on the 9th of September when Villars had arrived, but was overruled by his allies, including Prince Eugene, who preferred to wait for troops still marching from Tournai to join them. That delay enabled Villars to strengthen his defensive fortifications and would cost the allies dearly. Very dearly. By the evening of Tuesday the 10th of September, Marlborough's army had finally assembled. He would throw approximately 86,000 men against Villars' 75,000. 160,000 men in a few square miles on the Franco-Belgian border. By the end of the next day, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 of them would be dead or wounded. Malplaquet would be the bloodiest battle fought in Europe in the whole of the 18th century. Whilst the Duke of Marlborough is remembered as one of Britain's greatest military commanders, at this battle, just like his others in this war, he commanded a multinational coalition. The British contributed somewhere in the region of 18,000 redcoats divided into 20 battalions of infantry and 6 cavalry regiments. Many of these had served in some or all of Marlborough's other great battles in this campaign, such as the 3rd Regiment of Foot, the Buffs, the 10th Foot, later the Lincolnshire Regiment, and the 16th Regiment of Foot, the Bedfordshires. However, by far the largest single national contingent were the Dutch under their Prince of Orange. Then there was the Imperial Habsburg Austrian army under Prince Eugene of Savoy, along with 22 battalions of Prussians and several other German states including Hanover, Hesse and Saxony, not forgetting the Danish forces also present in Marlborough's army. His plan was the same he'd employed before: heavy attacks on both French flanks to force Villars to draw troops from his centre, which would then be overwhelmed by the Allied infantry reserve, followed by a mass cavalry charge. The 11th of September 1709 dawned with a thick mist concealing the opposing armies from each other. At about 7:30 a.m. the fog lifted and the 2 armies traded artillery shots. An hour later, a salvo from 40 Allied guns gave the signal for Marlborough's attack. Prince Eugene took command of the Allied right, facing the French left under Marshal Villars, and ordered 36 battalions of Austrians and Saxons into the Sars Wood, under the command of General Schulenburg. Before they even reached the woods, the advancing Austrians had to negotiate marshy ground, streams and fallen trees, and somewhere in the dark woods lay their enemy. Hidden in the woods, the defenders could hear the Allied drummers beating martial airs, growing louder as the infantry approached. The French let them approach within pistol shot and delivered a devastating volley which sent them staggering back. Now 22 battalions of Prussians under 59-year-old General Karl Lothams also entered the woods, but disordered by the ground and thinned by heavy losses, they too were forced back. An English brigade under the Duke of Argyll went in to support Lotham's flagging assault. British, Prussians and Austrians struggled forward from tree to tree, tripping over felled trunks and fighting the French hand to hand. The battle in the woods lasted over 3 hours. Prince Eugene himself was injured in the head by a musket ball. Refusing to leave the field, he continued to command as blood streamed down his face. Villars reinforced his position by sending the Royal Regiment of Ireland, the famous Wild Geese, exiled Jacobite soldiers serving France, into the woods to bolster his defences. With what contemporaries described as their usual ferocity, they hurled the Allied troops back through the trees. And then, in one of the most poignant encounters of the battle, the Royal Regiment of Ireland, the Wild Geese, fighting for France, came face to face with their compatriots, the 18th Royal Irish Regiment, fighting for Marlborough and Queen Anne. It was Irishman against Irishman, separated only by the cause they served. Meanwhile, what was happening elsewhere on the battlefield? Well, about a half an hour after Schulenburg and Lotham's initial attack on the Allied right, so about 9:30 a.m, the Prince of Orange launched the Dutch assault against the French right. They advanced into a hail of musket balls and grape shot, and then the concealed 20 cannon opened a devastating enfilade fire. It was a massacre. The Dutch lost about 5,000 men in 30 minutes. That sounds like something out of the Battle of the Somme in the First World War, doesn't it? His horse shot from under him, the Prince of Orange tried to rally his reeling troops. Seizing the flag of one of the Swiss regiments in his army, he ran up to the French earthworks in front of Blaron Farm and planted it on the parapet. The Dutch advance resumed, still under that murderous fire. 2 of their generals fell, leading their men forward. But when the exhausted and shattered Dutch reached the French defensive lines, they were thrown back by a counter-attack. The Prince joined his men as they retreated all the way back to their starting line. His attack had been a catastrophe. Military historians debate to this day whether he exceeded or simply misinterpreted Marlborough's order to tie down the French right wing. Nevertheless, that is exactly what he did achieve. When Villars sent an urgent message to D'Artagnan requesting troops to be sent to shore up his crumbling left, D'Artagnan refused, as he had his hands full fending off that determined Dutch attack. While this had all been going on, British General Henry Withers, with 19 battalions, including 5 British, had been executing a wide flanking march through the woods towards the village of La Folie. Withers had been soldiering since the 1670s, and his battles included Tangiers, Sedgemoor and Blenheim. Despite taking longer than expected, when he did appear on the far left of the French position at around midday, Villars was forced to draw 12 battalions from his centre to secure his left. Once more, just like his victories at Blenheim, Ramillies and Oudenarde, Marlborough's plan at Malplaquet was working. The French centre was weakening, although at a huge cost. At around 1 p.m, at the critical moment when the battle hung in the balance, Marshal Villars was suddenly struck by a musket ball. It passed through the top of his high boot, penetrated below his left kneecap, and shattered the bone. Despite his injury, Villars, characteristically, refused to leave the field. He attempted to try to remove the bullet himself, and then asked to be placed in a chair so he could continue directing the battle from a seated position. But the pain and blood loss proved too much, and he soon lost consciousness and had to be carried from the field insensible. Command now devolved to the 67-year-old Marshal Beauflair. He had been in charge of the French right wing, but now had control over the whole battlefield, even though he hadn't previously been aware of what was going on in the centre or in the woods on the French left. The fact that he was able to successfully save the French army says a lot about his experience and calmness under pressure. But before that, he would personally lead at least 6 cavalry charges. With the French centre now critically weakened by Villars' redeployment of troops to his left, Marlborough directed Lord Orkney to advance his British and Hanoverian infantry directly against the French centre. The Allied battery had been moved forward and began a heavy bombardment of the main line of redoubts. Count Schulenburg managed to drag 7 additional cannon through the woods to add enfilading fire against the French positions. Combined with the 30 guns of the Great Battery now pounding the centre, the firepower concentrated on the French redoubts was devastating. Despite their depleted numbers, the French defenders in the centre fought hard, but eventually the Allied numbers prevailed, and the defenders fell back behind their cavalry. Marlborough now decided to finish the French off and ordered his cavalry forward at about 1:30 p.m. As 25,000 horsemen charged through the gaps between the redoubts, they were met by 12,000 French cavalry, including the elite Maison de Rue, Louis's household cavalry, led by Marshal Boufflers himself. Considered the best cavalry in Europe, they pushed the Allied cavalry back to the redoubts, where they themselves were then checked by the fire of Orkney's infantry. 6 times the Allied cavalry charged, 6 times they were met by the French countercharge, each one led by the 67-year-old French marshal. For about an hour, the conflict raged as men and horses rode at each other, slashing with swords or discharging firearms in each other's faces. Clouds of dust enveloped friend and foe alike, powdering uniforms and making distinction almost impossible. Wounded horses, maddened by the pain and fear, kicked their way free from the crush. In the midst of the French cavalry rode James Francis Stuart, the old Pretender, whose father had been driven from the English, Scottish and Irish thrones by Queen Anne's sister and brother-in-law, William of Orange, during the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Using the title the Chevalier de St. George, the man who claimed to be their rightful king charged repeatedly with French cavalry against armies that included thousands of his supposed subjects. By 3 p.m, Boufflers recognised that the battle could not be won. He now performed what many contemporaries and historians consider a supreme piece of generalship. He managed to untangle his squadrons from that ongoing cavalry melee and manoeuvre them to cover the retreat of the entire French army for over 15 miles, 25 kilometres. And as if to emphasise that this was no rout, he was also able to carry off most of the French wounded and most of his guns, a testament to the orderliness of his withdrawal. The Allies were simply too exhausted to pursue them. They had been fighting for over 6 hours and had lost nearly 21,000 men killed or wounded, almost a quarter of their whole army. The Dutch alone had lost over 8,000 men, whilst the British had lost nearly 1,800. The French army, on the other hand, had suffered somewhere between 11,000 and 14,000 casualties. Malplaquet would be the bloodiest battle fought in Europe in the entire 18th century. And whilst Marlborough had forced the French to withdraw and could therefore claim it as a victory, it had come at a huge cost. The winners had actually lost twice as many men as the losers. As Villars, when he'd recovered, later wrote to King Louis, "If God grants us the grace to lose such a battle again, your Majesty can count on all his enemies being destroyed." The immediate impact of Malplaquet was political rather than military. The unprecedented carnage rocked Allied confidence. The Dutch, who had suffered over a third of the total casualties, bitterly blamed the Prince of Orange for his bloody assault, but also Marlborough's tactics. Splits started to develop in the alliance. In Britain, a growing belief took hold that English money and men were being poured into a needless war. The Tories used the Malplaquet casualty figures to attack Marlborough and the pro-war Whig Party. Marlborough's fame and power rested on 2 pillars: his military genius and his political support at home. Malplaquet cracked both pillars simultaneously. On his return to England after the 1709 campaign, Marlborough's enemies used the casualty figures to sully his reputation. He was portrayed as callous and bloodthirsty, a man who would happily let his soldiers die for personal glory and advancement. There were even revived fears that Marlborough aspired to be a second Oliver Cromwell. Meanwhile, Marlborough's wife Sarah's close friendship with Queen Anne for nearly 30 years had given Marlborough both prestige and protection in London. That friendship was wearing thin, mainly thanks to Sarah's sharp tongue and nagging. Queen Anne conspicuously failed to send Marlborough a letter of thanks for Malplaquet, the only one of his 4 major victories to be so overlooked. This was a devastating public signal of royal disfavour, and one seized upon his political opponents, who both wanted to end the war and who feared Marlborough's ultimate ambitions. Paradoxically, Malplaquet, technically a defeat, had an enormously positive effect on French morale and national resolve. After the humiliations of Blenheim in 1704, Ramillies 1706 and Oudenarde in 1708, the French army had finally stood its ground against the best the Grand Alliance could throw at them, inflicted twice as many casualties as they had suffered, and withdrawn in good order. The sense of national pride was immense. Soldiers actually cheered as they retreated, treating the battle as a moral victory, and so it was seen in France too. By preserving the army in good order, Villars and Blenheim had prevented an invasion of France. It was in some ways for the French similar to how the British viewed Dunkirk in 1940. In the Second World War, the British army had been rescued whilst leaving all their heavy equipment in France. Nevertheless, they'd live to fight another day. And that's how the French saw their escape from Malplaquet, and they'd inflicted horrendous casualties on Marlborough's army in the process. The French would fight on for another 4 years. In October 1710, a general election in Britain produced a crushing Tory victory. The new government opposed the war but retained Marlborough as head of the army. His popularity with the soldiers and European allies made him too dangerous to dismiss immediately. But having been unable to reproduce another great victory and accused of embezzling funds earmarked for paying his allies, he was finally dismissed on the 31st of December 1711. His successor, the Tory-supporting Duke of Ormond, was given restraining orders, forbidding him from engaging in battles or sieges, effectively hamstringing the Allied army. Without active British support, Prince Eugene was defeated by Villars at Dinant in 1712. The Treaty of Utrecht followed in 1713, which ended the war, but on far more favourable terms to France than Louis had been offered back in 1709, before Malplaquet. Marlborough himself went into self-imposed exile on the continent. He only returned to royal favour with the accession of King George I in 1714. Suffering a stroke in 1716 that ended his active career, he died in 1722. It was the end of one of Britain's greatest military commanders. But what is interesting is that it wasn't his Pyrrhic victory at Malplaquet, the bloodiest battle of the 18th century, that he's remembered for, but his first, back in 1704 at Blenheim. On that occasion, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, produced the greatest victory by an English commander fighting in continental Europe since Henry V at Agincourt. A victory that was immortalised in the palace that a grateful nation paid for in Oxfordshire, Blenheim Palace. And it was at Blenheim Palace in 1874 that one of his descendants was born. Rather like the first Duke, he had his wins and losses too, but nevertheless is regarded as a worthy successor. Winston Churchill. Well, I hope you enjoyed both this episode and this whole mini-series on the Duke of Marlborough and his 4 great battles and victories over the French. And if you've missed any, I'll put links to them all in the description. Oh, and also in the description, you'll find ways on how you can support my channel, from becoming a patron, to making a one-off donation, or simply getting a free newsletter. And a big thanks to all of you who already are supporting me, including Edwin, Charlotte, and Outbush again. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.